Okay, come on, Troy. You got this, dude. You've been a YouTuber for like 12 years or something at this point. You can do this. You got this. Okay. Let's see. YouTuber voice. Hey, what's up, you guys? Wasn't supposed to read the first part. No, just kidding. Hey, what's up, you guys? Your favorite, inconsistent, washed up YouTuber is back with yet another video that made no sense in the context of his online video career, but makes perfect sense in the context of my life. Basically, long story short, I'm still an advertising major here, but because of some dope poetry classes that I've taken junior and senior year, I decided to just say, hey, screw it, and focus my entire honors senior thesis on analyzing, creating, reading as much poetry as I possibly can in a single semester. And so far it's been awesome. I've been focusing specifically on a group of poets who have really sparked my interest. One of them is Emily Dickinson, who I'm going to be talking about today. While doing research for this project though, I found out that so many poets have such cool life stories, and I kind of wanted to share them with you guys because I thought they were cool. And I've heard of Emily Dickinson before, but I never really knew all these cool things about her life. And I figured, hey, by telling people stuff, if people found out how cool and interesting the poets were, it might make them want to read the actual poetry, which I think would be really cool. Because poetry, art, and self-expression, and viewing the world through a different lens than you might normally do, it's a pretty cool thing, in my opinion. So hey, if you watch this video, want to go read some Emily Dickinson, perfect. Just want to watch this video, learn some stuff for some Jeopardy answers later, I got you on that too. Anyway, I'm Troy. This is part of my honors senior thesis, I guess. So with all that said, as I said, first poet who we're going to be talking about today is Emily Dickinson. Above all else, Dickinson is famous for taking the now common Twitter meme notion of, I don't want to leave my house today, to the extreme, rarely leaving the grounds of her house in the last 21 years of her life. And we'll get into some possible rationales for that fact later on in the video. However, despite her reclusive nature, she was no Earl Sweatshirt, as she actually loved going outside, and had an immense appreciation of nature, one of the major themes of her almost 1,800 poems that she wrote throughout her life. Tending to her garden was one of the biggest joys that occupied her time, and she even eventually added a conservatory to her home garden so that she could also grow warm climate plants. Because I don't know if you know this, but it gets, as the locals would say, wicked cold in Massachusetts. She had a leather-bound journal with over 400 different pressed flower species that she collected and labeled according to the Linnaean system. As a plant lover myself, who had to give my 3 succulents to my mom to take care of because I couldn't do it, I was pretty impressed by that. A common gift that she would send her friends was a bunch of flowers with some poetic verses attached. But Wikipedia says that people often valued the posy more than the poetry. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to include that joke, but I just had to. It was just that bad. Okay, sorry, just had to include that, and also I promise I'm done talking about plants. If you want to see the actual leather-bound journal, which is technically called a herbarium, I guess, you can find it in the library at Harvard University. Anyway, back to what she's known for, her prolific poetry. Although she's now widely considered one of the most famous and essential American poets of all time, during her life, she published fewer than a dozen poems. This left the rest of her 1,800 poems to be discovered and published only after she died. Now, if you're like me and upon hearing this your first thought is, oh, how is this possible? Chances are you're probably also a male, because one of the most convincing pieces of evidence as to why Dickinson was not so widely published in her life was due to the mere fact that she was a woman. In Cynthia Wolfe's fantastic book about Dickinson, which along with another book by Robert McClure Smith and the Emily Dickinson Museum website provides the bulk of the resources used for this video. Wolfe brings up the fact that in Dickinson's time, although women were societally allowed to write, they were not viewed as being capable of being intellectual. Women were allowed and expected to experience emotions, but not intelligence, and Dickinson didn't really see it as worth her time to try and publish in a society that did not truly value her talents. Sadly, her own father also did not value her talents either, or take her seriously as a writer. In what is surely one of the best cases of backing the wrong horse in dad history, he proclaimed his son's writings as altogether before Shakespeare without even taking a bit of notice into his genius daughter's writings. She was literally Emily Dickinson. This fostered a great sense of well-deserved resentment from Dickinson towards her father. A tale that Woolf includes in her book shows how this resentment tended to boil over and also makes Dickinson sound like a total badass. Edward Dickinson was quick to notice any lapse of attention on the part of his womenfolks. In his code, there was no room for carelessness. The well-known anecdote of the plate illustrates this point. One day, sitting down at the dinner table, he inquired whether a certain nicked plate must always be placed before him. Emily took the hint. She carried the plate to the garden and pulverized it on a stone. Just to remind her, she said, not to give it to her father again. The other main reason she wasn't published is because her writing was super ahead of its time. The poems of Dickinson's that were published were heavily edited and took away some of the aspects that made her poetry so gripping and distinctive. Her famous dashes, lack of titles, unconventional capitalization and punctuation, and especially her short lines, were all incredibly distinctive of her poetry, written primarily in the mid-1800s. These same aspects, which were deemed necessary to be edited out by the editors at the time, were embraced like 70 years later with the modernist poetry movement that was a pushback on traditional formalism in poetry. In this way, by not publishing her poems, Dickinson was a visionary and a genius, allowing her work to live on forever on her own terms and in her own true words. After the modernist movement, a cult following formed around her work. The second wave of feminism, which began in the early 1960s, also brought attention and great cultural sympathy to her work. This also coincided with the first scholarly publication of her poems in 1955. That's like 100 years since she started writing poetry. This was because Dickinson's sister consulted both her brother's wife and her brother's mistress for help with publishing them. And then the manuscripts got divided between the two families' houses. A real shame. That seemed like such a great idea. I can't believe that went wrong. Another way that Dickinson was ahead of her time is that just like today's millennials, she was obsessed with death. Despite her legacy as a hermit and recluse, early on in her life, Dickinson was super social. In one of her letters, she states, "I expect I shall be the belle of Amherst when I reach my 17th year. I don't doubt that I will have crowds of admirers at that age." However, she was extremely affected by death throughout the course of her life. Her second cousin and close friend died from typhus, and the terror and permanence of the condition immediately gripped her. This, along with nature, became another major theme of her work. 2 years after the death, she wrote, "It seemed to me that I should die too if I couldn't be permitted to watch over her or even look at her face." She got so depressed that she took a break from school in Amherst and stayed with other family in Boston to recover, but soon returned to her studies. The very next year, there was a religious revival in Amherst, and Dickinson found peace in God for a while. I think faith in God lessened her fear of death, but only temporarily. She stopped going to church 7 years later and started her 236th poem, "Some people keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home." As a recovering Catholic schoolboy, same. Throughout her life, with each new death of a close friend, family member, or anyone else she had to withstand, her fear and terror about the concept of death grew stronger. Dickinson also dealt with an eye injury from her most productive years of writing. Her eye problems began around the year 1861 or 62, and it was during this time that she had her most prolific years of writing and editing. In 1862 alone, she wrote 366 poems. Woolf suggests that this incredibly prolific output may be because she feared she would go blind and wanted to get all of her writing and papers in order. She spoke of this time in her life as a terror, although it cannot be certain that blindness is the terror she's referring to. In 1864 and 65, she traveled to Boston in order to undergo treatment for her eye, and it is when she returned to Amherst after the treatment that she began rarely venturing outside the grounds of her home. There have been countless interpretations and rationalizations for Dickinson's physical isolation during the last portion of her life. Poet Adrienne Rich posits that genius knows itself, and that Dickinson's isolation was simply the choice she knew she had to make in order to create to her highest potential. Some scholars speculate that she was agoraphobic or epileptic. It also could have been that leaving home reminded her of the treatment for her eye injury. In the first place, she was never much for travel, and traveled very infrequently before her eye accident, once leaving Massachusetts for just a few weeks. She generally preferred to remain in Amherst with her poems and plants. Another major factor that led to her homebody nature was the illness and subsequent confinement to bed of her mother. One of the Dickinson children needed to step up and take on the domestic responsibilities of the house, and Emily was the perfect child to fill this role. Once 1867 rolled around, she spoke to visitors only from the other side of a door, never face to face. However, even though she was physically secluded, the multitude of writings and correspondences she had with friends until her last days shows she was still socially active and expressive. Although she was never married, she had an interesting correspondence with her brother's wife, Susan Gilbert Dickinson. Emily told Susan that they are the only poets, and everyone else is prose, as well as once saying, "Come with me this morning to the church within our hearts, where the bells are always ringing, and the preacher, whose name is Love, shall intercede for us." That's a pretty awkward love triangle, but love finds a way, I guess. She also considered marrying Judge Otis Phillips Lord, but then didn't. Her prolific writing period ended in 1865. Her father died 9 years later in 1874. What was left of her mother's deteriorating health was all but destroyed in 1875 when she suffered a stroke. Her nephew Gibb died at the age of 8 in 1883, and Phillips Lord died in 1884. This only strengthened her sense of melancholy and fixation on death in her final years. In the last days of her life, Dickinson wrote, "Isaac pleads again, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" To sum this all up, I think Woolf puts it best. In his role as creator, God fashioned a world of time and death. But despite being so preoccupied with it for much of her life, in Dickinson's role as an artistic creator, the voice of her verse could confound death and has found a way to transcend time. And that's my first video essay by me, Troy. I hope you guys liked it. If you liked it, let me know somehow.